Hi. Okay, well, welcome to this specific webinar for aviation and airport services industry. Today's webinar is brought to us by the Ngahora and the New Zealand Disabilities Employers Network. I'd like to warmly welcome those that have attended today, but also I want to acknowledge and welcome those that may join and watch this recording post this webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to elevate and future-proof our organisations to embrace disability as a strategic advantage. Now, today's webinar will be recorded, as I mentioned earlier, and this is with the intention of sharing these resources to empower all of our practice. Please, throughout the session, feel free to use the chat function, comment, ask questions, because we love being able to answer specific questions that you may be facing in your industry or your workplace. From time to time, we may stop, open it up for discussion, and if not, we'll just keep checking the chat and make sure that we answer some of those questions. Again, the session is to empower us all, so please let's take this opportunity that we have. My name is Marina Masame. I am Ringahora's Industry Engagement Lead, or one of them. And today, let's allow me, please, to open us up with a tatalo karakia in Samoan this morning. Te whapitei lea tua o tātou putupoto whaatasi, whapitei o whaatasi mai whiu, ia whaamanuia mai mato whanutanga, sua kwa Yesu Kiriso. Amen. It is now my privilege and honour to introduce us to the one that's the real driver of the session. Phil Turner is the CEO for New Zealand Disabilities Employer Network and has for many, many years been an advocate and champion for people with disabilities, because supporting people with disabilities actually supports everyone. You will hear many messages throughout today, but specifically we want to hear from you. What are some of the challenges that you're facing in the industry? And Phil will do his very best to answer those questions and give you those tools or answers, or even lead you to more resources post this. So without further ado, I pass it over to none other than the CEO for New Zealand Disabilities Employers Network. Over to you, Phil Turner.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone for having me along this morning. As Marina has introduced me, I'm the Chief Executive for the New Zealand Disability Employers Network, and we work with organisations on their own disability and neurodiversity inclusion journeys, whether that be from their employment, but also the way that they serve customers and bring all of that forward. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Our organisation runs on the vision of New Zealand organisations realise the true potential of disabled and neurodivergent people to the benefit of everyone. A little bit about that. The realise is designed to have a double innuendo. First of all, is that you realise there's potential, and then that you bring that potential out and you realise it and you raise it. And to the benefit of everyone says that we're never going to sit here and say, we want you to do this because it's the socially right thing to do. We want you to do it because it's the smart thing to do. It's business smart. It's good for your reputation. It's good for your bottom line. It all makes sense. I'm going to cover some of that as we go on today. So I do have quite a few slides that I've prepared. They are a guide and an opportunity for us to move forward and to get things working. But also, please do ask questions. If I think it's coming up in the slides, I'll say so. If I don't, and it's something that we should stop and answer, then I'm going to stop and answer it, because I want this to be all about you getting what you want to get, not me just talking at a screen for the next little bit. But this morning, I'm hoping that we can do a little bit about what do we mean by disability, why disability is good for our organisations, what we can do to step into disability, and talking about where, when we get this right, it can make a real difference to individuals' lives, to our organisations, and to society. So good on all fronts. But before I do that, I probably should actually spend a few minutes setting the scene. What do I actually mean by disability? When we're talking about disability, it's such a broad term. Most people tend to go to somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who's blind or low vision, maybe somebody who's deaf. But I want to talk about the fact that there are many different types of disabilities. There are the vision disabilities, and vision disabilities impairments, vision impairments, can be things along the lines of blindness and low vision, but can also go into things like colour blindness and other areas as well. And the experience of somebody who is blind, only 5% of blind low vision's clients actually see nothing and only see black. Most have at least some light perception, with many actually having what some of us would consider quite some functional vision. But they can see their surrounds, the different experiences depending on whether it's macular degeneration or, for me, keratoconus. I'm legally blind in my right eye, so no license for me. No flight pilot's license for me. Whatever it is, we go from there. But interestingly, I'm allowed to drive a car and I've got 20/20 vision with my glasses on, so everyone's happy. It's just if I get something between my eyes, then all of a sudden that right eye, when that's in play, that's when I have problems. Hearing as well, we can talk about deafness, hard of hearing, tinnitus, which is that ringing sound you get in your ears after a event, a loud event, or you're being somewhere, but this is permanent. Physical disabilities are really broad. This can be anything from things that are muscular related, central nervous system related. All of it comes into, so neurological diseases to an extent come into this. But it can be just in regards to being able to, the agility of your limbs, but it can also be amputation, and paralysis and other areas as well. Neurodiversity and learning differences, there are so many of them that I just can't get there. The ones that we tend to know about are ADHD, representing about 5% of the population, estimate about 5% of the population, 1 in 20. Autism, about 2%. Dyslexia, about 10%. Dyscalculia, lower but still prevalent, and dyspraxia, and that's just to name a few. I have another neurodiversity called aphantasia, and that means that I don't visualize. And I actually just, if somebody says, imagine an apple in front of me, I don't. I can't. There is no apple. It just as a joke, thinking about the Matrix, where there is no spoon, well, there wouldn't be a spoon for me. Neurological, this can be anything from traumatic brain injuries, photosensitive epilepsy, memory loss, dementia, Down syndrome, all play a difference. But then we also need to actually think about temporary disabilities. These are disabilities that aren't long enough to be counted long term, but they do disable a person in the short term. So broken arms or broken limbs, anything sprained, all of that comes into play. Situational disabilities is actually pointing out that people can have things that disable them in the short term that aren't actually an impairment of their own, but it's the environment that they're in. So poor lighting, if you're trying to read in poor lighting, then that's going to disable you with your reading ability. If the venue is loud, if either you're at a bar and the music's loud and you're having trouble talking with each other, we can argue that you're temporarily disabled in that environment. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that fairly soon. But what we're trying to point out here is when we make changes, and I'll bring this theory right through today's presentation, when we make changes for the 2%, the 3% of people who may have one particular impairment, it benefits so many more people, and it comes forward. And a classic example of this, I believe in the States now, 80% of Netflix users actually watch at least some of the time with their captions on, and 50% of users watch all the time with their captions on. And so they're using that to supplement the audible information that they're getting, but that adjustment that came for deaf and hard of hearing people primarily, and also benefited some in the neurodivergent space, actually then moved on to benefit so many more of us. In New Zealand, we're talking about 17% of New Zealanders are disabled. That's 17. Used to be 24 up until about 2 months ago when we got our new statistics. They changed the way that they were measuring disability, and so we dropped a little bit. That didn't mean that people's impairments or needs changed. It just meant that there were a few less people that met the bar of being disabled. And again, I'm going to explore that topic as we go through. Globally, and obviously with the airline and aviation sector, that is absolutely a part of this. We are looking at about 1.3 billion people in the world. So similar stats. Now, I mentioned before that we had a drop in the statistics. So we went from 24 to 17. And that's because of the way that we changed the how we measure and discuss it. But it is worth pausing here to explore that just a little bit, because I think it can lead to one of those aha moments where you sit there and you say, oh, now I fully understand what's going on there. So the first part of this, I'm sorry, I'm just resizing my screen a little bit, so I'm not always looking across to the left for my notes. The questions that we got asked in the census were questions like, do you have difficulty seeing even if wearing glasses? Do you have difficulty hearing even if wearing hearing aids? Do you have difficulty walking or climbing steps, remembering or concentrating, washing all over? And the last one, just to say, is communicating in your customary usual language. So New Zealand Sign Language users, unless they have a physical impairment, wouldn't be disabled in this because they can communicate with each other just fine. But communicating with the rest of us, well, that's a whole nother game for them. But they're not disabled in their ability to communicate. It's a translation issue. So when we did that, we were given 4 levels of answer that we could give. No difficulty, some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, or unable to do it all. When we answered unable to do it all, or a lot of difficulty, that was when you went on to what they called the Household Disability Survey, the New Zealand Household Disability Survey, and you might get identified as disabled. And they do an additional piece of research with a smaller portion of people, and get some really, it's interesting what they do and how they do it. But that does leave a lot of people that answered that some difficulty. And if we think about neurodivergent people, so ADHDers, for instance, they might not answer that they have a lot of difficulty remembering or concentrating. They're probably more aligned to answer, I have some difficulty. And the same thing happened when we looked at gender. So females, 18% of people ended up disabled. For males, it ended up as 15%. I don't know, maybe males are just a little bit less willing to talk and a little bit more stoic in how they report and what's going on. It's the first time we've seen that split in statistics between the gender that I can find in New Zealand history for disability. Really interesting sort of process. But what I want to talk to you about is when we add that some difficulty back in, we've got, for adults in the 15 to 16 4-year-olds, so the working aged adults, we're talking 14% of adults are actually officially disabled, but 32%. So overall, 46% of working age adults have at least some difficulty in one of those functional domains. So 470,000 disabled adults, 1,081 people with at least 81,000, sorry, 1,081,000 people with at least some difficulty, and it's 1.7 or 1.8 million without. But we're talking significant numbers here. And if we add in all adults, so we get our senior and citizens included now, this actually jumps to 52%. So the balance tips. 52% of adults have at least some difficulty in one of the functional domains. And there's a rule here, most disabled people have more than one need. It's more than half of disabled people have more than one need, so we could extend and correlate that out. So it's at least some difficulty in one of the 14 areas of functional domain. So what I'm trying to do here is create a picture for you that when we make changes for that 17%, we actually benefit another 35% of people, or half the population. And if we take that out and we really do explore that, there are some ways I can get that down a little bit lower level for you and talk about the fact that there are only 1% of the population is officially deaf or hard of hearing in the way that they measured it recently. It dropped from 4% to 1%. But if we add that some difficulty from the census responses, we're able to extend that up to 14.1% of the population, or 1 in 7 people. If we look at the communicating, we're at 1 in 17 people have trouble communicating, at least some difficulty communicating in their chosen or their preferred language. As I explained before, New Zealand Sign Language users should not have shown up in this, because they'd be able to communicate unless they had a physical disability that changed the way that they could say. So they could no longer say, hi, my name is Phil. If they couldn't do that because they lack the dexterity, then they would show up in this statistic. And here's the interesting one. So for remembering or concentrating, we go from somewhere between 2 and 4%. They're separate figures, and they both come in at 2% in the household disability survey. But when we had them in the census, they were joined together. And so to compare them, but in the census, nearly 1 in 5, 19.4% of people said they had at least some difficulty remembering or concentrating. Sight's another interesting one. We go from 4% of the population who are officially blind or low vision to 19.3%, or that 1 in 5 figure again. So 1 in 5 people have at least some difficulty seeing, even whilst wearing glasses. That's the caveat that we've got here. This is after they're using their assistive devices and tools to help with it. So they're still having challenges. Walking or climbing steps, again, we go up to 14.4% of the population. I believe it sits somewhere in the 2 to 3%. And washing or dressing goes from 1% to 5.1%. So they're some of our people with our highest physical needs. So it's really interesting just to explore that and talk about the fact that when there's a rule that I have, or a saying that I use that I've sort of coined, and it says when we build for the 80%, we serve the 80%. When we build for the 20%, we serve the 100%. So from a customer's perspective, but we're also going to explore this from an employment perspective today as well. So I'll go from there. Now, I want to talk a little bit, pause for a second. I'm on a roll. I actually should ask, does anyone have any questions about those statistics or clarity around that before I move on? I'm going to grab a quick sip of my tea. Please do put questions in chat. But if I'm good at communicating and it makes complete sense, that's absolutely fine too. Okay. Thanks, Marina. All right, so let's go on. I just want to talk about the way that I am going to refer to disability in this presentation, and this aligns with the New Zealand Disability Strategy. There are lots of different models of disability, but the two I want to talk about today are probably where the majority of people are thinking today in New Zealand and across the globe, versus how disabled people perceive themselves and what's going on there. So the medical model of disability is probably where the majority of the population is at. And what it says is people are disabled by their impairments or differences, and basically there's something wrong with them, and we need to either fix them or we do our best to accommodate them. So it's the problem of the person. The person owns has the responsibility to engage in society. We're just going to do our best. And it's a disability as a consequence of a health condition, disease caused by trauma, something that disrupts the functioning of a person in a physiological or cognitive way. Okay, so that's where most of us think about disability. I want to introduce you to the social model. And what the social model says is that a person is not disabled by their difference or impairment, but rather by the decision that we've made as a society that prevents them from being able to participate equitably. It looks at what's wrong with the decisions that we've made as a society and says, how do we fix this? So what it does is it sees disability as a social construct, meaning that the society creates an environment that favours the non-disabled majority, that 80% that I was talking about. We've built for the 80%, so we're serving the 80%. Where the social model says, actually, I built a environment around disability. We didn't put a ramp in to the building. We can bring it right back to the most simplistic terms. We didn't put a ramp into the building, and so we disabled with our decisions that wheelchair user, but also the mother with the pram from a situational disability point of view, also the courier with the trolley of goods, also the person with some other mobility issues. So by making a decision not to do that, it has a range of flowing impacts that disable the person. Same thing when we build our websites without considering digital accessibility. Same thing when we set up our workplaces without considering how other people with different types of needs would be able to join our workplaces. I've just got a little video here. You get a little bonus. We didn't do this on Tuesday. So I've got a little video here, which is just such an easy way of looking at this. I'm hoping that it doesn't play the ad. Apologies if it does beforehand, because it is a YouTube. So it's just a bit of a cheeky, and it's an old one now, but it's so good. I haven't seen anything that's better. It's just a bit of a cheeky approach to explaining that social model of disability and bringing that forward. Any questions about the social model of disability or the medical model of disability before I move on? No? All right. Okay, so I want to talk and start by acknowledging why disability is good for our organisation. So the first thing I always look at here is let's look at some of the challenges that you're facing as a sector. So I asked Ringahora, and these were some of the points that they raised in regards to it. And actually with some recent research I've done, I can probably help with some of the customer side as well. So some of the key sector's key challenges are attracting, recruiting, training and retention of staff. And I believe that this is a broad sort of issue that comes in. Sorry, I'm just going to, I had the same problem last one. I should have learned, just close that line so that my face looks a little bit more even. Okay, so I'll come back to it. There's a broad area that's going on here around attracting, recruiting and training and retention of staff. It's to do with both, you've got an aging workforce, it's getting job seekers and the new generation to connect to it, as well as people who are looking for a career change. So that's how do we bring them into our thing? How do we bring them into our organisation and make it attractive and bring it forward? It's also about educating people to ensure that they have the facts around everything that's going on. So there's lots of different things that come into play here. And these are just some of the key challenges. So I want to just talk to you about the opportunity factor here that sits here. There's a mixture of both opportunity factor from your client perspective, but also opportunity factor that comes forward with there. So in Australia, disabled domestic tourism equates to 21% of the total domestic tourism spend, or $6.8 billion. This was from the July 2023 quarter. Really interesting to sort of look at that. So from a tourism point of view, there's some stuff going on there. The best I've been able to find in a New Zealand accessible tourism study is the AUT study in 2014 that conservatively estimated accessible tourism in New Zealand to be worth 700 million. Now, when I get ChatGPT or Copilot as it was to adjust that for inflation, it tells me that it's $960 million in today's thing. So I'm going to round that up and say 1 billion. Just because it's so close, I can round that up. Okay, in Australia, it's actually 8 billion. In the UK and England, this study talked about 15 billion. In Spain, 2.4 billion. Across Europe, in 2014, it was estimated to be worth 90 billion euros. So we are talking big, big figures. It was 15 billion pound, by the way, 8 billion Australian dollars, 2.4 billion euro for Spain. So it depends on what what currency they were in. And if I go a step further and talk about the fact that almost 50% of people aged more than 60 are disabled, this is according to the UN's reports in 2022, and disabled travellers tend to travel accompanied by 2 or 3 travel companions, so actually bringing more people with them. And 2 out of 3 of disabled people in developed economies are likely to have the means to travel. It's not a small thing not to consider. And I just talk about the fact that we've just done some research with Air New Zealand. Now, I am not, I'll be very clear here, I am not speaking on behalf of Air New Zealand. And the details I've got to show here are but a very small excerpt of a very large report with a lot of information. But the New Zealand Disability Employers Network, with our partners, Access Advisors and Jones Consultancy, have just completed a research project for Air New Zealand around their end-to-end disabled customer experience. We managed to get 2,700 responses to the survey that we did, and this was a 20-minute survey. It took about between 15 and 20 minutes to complete, from across the disability sector. And we did that by doing a really broad outreach to try and make sure that what we delivered for Air New Zealand was meaningful. We used everything from our contacts with the Ministry of Disabled People to use their social media. We used our own contacts. We actually sent it out to 170 different organisations in order to do it, so that it went really broad across the disability sector. And so we used this extensive list of contacts to get a really positive outcome. And so 2,700 respondents. We blew our budget out. We thought we'd get 500. And yeah, so we got down to 500. We were thinking we would get 500 respondents. 500 to 1,000 would be fantastic. 2,700, let's just say that we blew our budget on trying to analyse that much data. It was just too much data. And on top of that, we had ethnographic research with 14 disabled travellers, where we actually took people across short haul to Australia and got them to understand what was going on. And on top of that, we bought all of the results that we got, the initial results from those two pieces of research, and we put them in front of a research group, an expert group that represented a broad range of disabilities, to get them to talk with each other and understand each other. And if we're talking about it from a traveller's point of view, now I'm taking Brian's thing here, where Brian has commented that is often forced into background, general aviation is often forced into background due to people's concept of aviation being linked to airlines instead of general aviation that supports much of New Zealand's infrastructure. I'd completely understand that, and hopefully what I'll bring forward in this training will talk about other portions of disability inclusion and going forwards. But also, I have this huge amount of information that we've gained from our research with Air New Zealand that it would be a shame not to at least bring in. So yeah, acknowledging that. Anyway, from the research, the key barriers, there were more than this, but I just wanted to bring these key barriers: environmental barriers, disabled confident staff barriers, and access to information. These were some of the overall key things. And if before I had the approval from Air New Zealand to list those, I had listed these from more generic sources: accessibility barriers to airports and on aircraft, the limited availability of appropriate support services, higher costs and logistical complexity, negative past experiences or safety concerns. And again, we are talking about a passenger experience here. Yeah, actually, I would ask that as well. So Marina's just put in the chat, Brian, any guidance you can give about the barriers that you're facing in a general aviation perspective, and that I can definitely relate some of the talk to there. So if you have any insights in relation to that, I'm definitely one of an adaptable type.
Sure. I think thanks for that opportunity. Sorry, I didn't mean to change your workflow. I think of it from two different perspectives, and one of that is the passenger experience, which is what you're addressing. I will routinely, Wanaka helicopters here, but we also have small planes, exploring much of New Zealand from even a tourism passenger standpoint. It's hard to describe accessibility two different disabilities, or people might not see it as an option. Getting into aircraft is difficult. You're not going down a jetway. You don't have the structure of scale of airports. So from a passenger experiment, we often have questions on flexibility, getting in and out of aircraft, availability for people, and there's some significant concerns for that in small aircraft, which much of New Zealand is only accessible for sightseeing via those kind of aircraft. So that's a barrier from the passenger standpoint. Usually physical, and it's necessarily hard to advertise the welcoming to that environment, and it's also hard to sometimes mechanically accommodate those scenarios. And the other picture is one from an employment standpoint, that there is very much a cultural barrier, I think, within the CAA to employment within aviation for people with, in my recent communications with them, neurodiversity, but certainly any other disabilities, thinking of the industry as very confident, physically able people, when there's lots of support roles which are not pilot and command roles, that we'd welcome people, but it's hard to advertise that in a balanced perspective to both invite applications, as well as in our survey prior to this meeting, everyone with any visible disabilities, we learned throughout our connections, were only people who were previously in the industry. They were pilots, they got injured, they stayed in the industry. There was no one that we could identify that came in with known disabilities, certainly in the lower third. So anyway, passenger that and so I look forward to learning more about both that passenger side as well as the employment side, and how we can help shift the picture.
Yep. I'm about to go on to a piece around employment, but I've just brought up one of the future slides. I've jumped forward a little bit where I talk about the fact of Section 80 of the CAA grants broad powers to AVSEC for security purposes and for that. But also that we need to be careful that they don't trip over the Human Rights Act. That the CAA Act, the Civil Aviation Act, does not supersede the Human Rights Act. And I actually went and looked at that as well in regards to the Human Rights Act. So in preparation for today, I went and looked at the carve-outs that exist within the Human Rights Act, because there are some around aviation, and they actually only exist for overseas crew. It's not actually, it doesn't exist for New Zealand-based crew. And so the Human Rights Act does still apply, in my understanding, and I'm not a lawyer, but in my understanding of the research. So bear with me, because I think we are going to very much get into, in fact, the next section goes into the why consider disability employment, and looking at it from that perspective and bringing that forwards. So I've done a little bit about the customer perspective based on the knowledge that we've got there, but we also do a lot on disability employment. And so I'm going to, let's keep going, and I'm going to circle back around. But thanks very much for bringing that to attention. And yeah, let's see where we land. So, if up to 1 in 6 working age New Zealanders are officially disabled, that's 17% of your potential customer base. So if we actually start to employ disabled people, then disabled people feel that they're seen, but also we actually get the experience, the lived experience of disabled people in our organisations. And the consequence of that is that we get better at engaging with individual stakeholders. When we make changes in our work environments, and even our customer environments for disabled people, they often benefit everyone. That's that 80% versus the 20% rule that I was talking about earlier. There are really great and good staff, and so we need to be able to attract and keep good staff. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that in relation to the actual sector, but also in relation to the brain drain that we've got coming up in a future slide. benefits of a diverse workforce actually help with innovation as well. And so I have a bit of a joke that I use where I talk around, if you want a good risk manager, hire a disabled person. And that's because disabled people manage risk their entire life around their own disability. They're professionals at it by default. And so that when they walk out their door or wheel out their door or move outside their door, whatever they're doing, they start managing the environments around them. And there's some really interesting stats where one of the biggest things that we hear is people say, oh, we can't hire disabled people, there'll be a health and safety risk. Well, actually, they have 1/5 less accidents, according to statistics that I've seen from Air New Zealand. So they actually have less accidents than non-disabled people. And on top of that, when you bring them into your workplaces, they actually increase health and safety outcomes, because it's not just a disabled person that's in there, it's Aroha, or Lucy, or Brian, or Mariner, or Stuart, or anyone else that's on this call, name that I can quickly access. It's the person that's there, and all of a sudden the team care. And when the team care, the team's attention pops up, and so health and safety outcomes increase. Really interesting perspectives that health and safety has been a real barrier to employment and a real perception change. I do get that you're in a heavy regulated section. I will address that soon. Obviously, the traditional reasons also do talk about the social and ethical benefits. We are going to be moving towards improving social equality, where it's a moral stance that's going to reflect society's changing values. Improving the lives of disabled people also help us leverage those new markets, and tackling discrimination and exclusion creates an inclusive business environment, so people are confident in who we are. Our brand raises. Now, I'm going to pause there because each of these I'm going to call out in a different way shortly. They actually pop up in a slightly different way from recent research that's been done. So I won't go into too much more detail because it's going to pop up. We also have the Human Rights Act. So discrimination happens when somebody is treated unfairly or less favourably than another person in the same or similar circumstances. Discrimination can be direct or indirect and generally takes the form of exclusion or rejection from something. Interestingly enough, in regards to this, we don't have good case law in New Zealand for me to sit there and say, here are the cases where this has been called out. And there's good reason for that. It's because we're a very inclusive society, and the way our law's written means that when somebody takes a human rights complaint to the Human Rights, not tribunal, because that's the later part, commission, to the Human Rights Commission, it goes through a process. And you get representation from the Office of the Human Rights Proceedings, which is lawyers that wrap around the person, and the Human Rights Commission. And we go, the first step is to raise the complaint and ask for a response from the business. And the second step is to go into mediation. Now, the lawyers, because they actually do their job, they identify that there's a potential challenge coming up here, and that the amount of bad publicity, the amount of whether they win or lose the case, it's a lose. They lose if it goes to the Human Rights Tribunal. The amount that they're at risk and everything else that goes on, actually, more often than not, it gets solved in that mediation. And cash does change hands. I can categorically say that cash changes hands, and that the complainant quite often walks away with a cash settlement. The lawyers probably get paid more than that cash settlement, but that's by the by. But the interesting part about that is it comes with a non-disclosure agreement. And so the disabled person pockets the money, but we never get that case at the Human Rights Tribunal that we can then use to reference for everyone else. Another thing is it takes about 8 years to go through that full process. It's ridiculously slow, between 5 and 8 years. But my understanding, edging more up to the 8 years if you went all the way through the process. And so the challenge here is, in Australia, we have the Sydney Olympics, we have Coles Myer, we have these landmark cases which we talk about in their community, and you can reference and say, if you don't get this right, you're going to be up the creek. In the States, there's a number of landmark cases. Probably one of the biggest is there's been aviation cases, but there has also been cases for Domino's Pizzas, one of the better ones. Blockbuster Video had one at one stage, and those become the landmark cases. And across Europe, there are other landmark cases as well. But we don't have that here, so I can't talk to you about them, which damages our fact that we don't actually move forwards. For those of you watching this today who are from the public sector, whether that's AVSEC, whether that's falling in, you also have responsibilities under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, in addition to the Human Rights Act. You are obligated to reasonably accommodate disabled people. And this is where I think there needs to be a little bit of challenging of some of the thinking that's going on. And I'm going to put that down today and talk about that, but we'll see where we land. And all above all of that, New Zealand has actually ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which also can be used in and around discrimination cases. When New Zealand law doesn't cover it, it keeps going up. And so we ratified this way back in 2018. Moving away from the legal, about getting a little bit more positive. I hate the legal, but I have to say it. Getting more into the positive. The interesting thing about the Deloitte Australia survey, vast majority of disabled workers are as productive or more productive than non-disabled workers. I think it's 90% of workers are as productive or more productive. So yeah, sure, there's a cohort of disabled people, which is what we think about when we talk about disabled, who aren't as productive, but actually the vast majority of people are. Most disabled workers have better attendance. So for instance, the stats that we hear is they take about 1/5 less sick leave and fewer health and safety, they take less sick leave and they have about 1/5 less health and safety issues than non-disabled people. And the last one I call out a little bit, we put it on there, it's the official lines that they use in the government and everything else like that. It says hiring disabled workers usually costs less than hiring non-disabled workers. I actually want to put that on and say it doesn't cost more than hiring non-disabled workers, but there are different costs in different ways. So you might get government assistance, you might get allocation of funding towards their equipment and things like that. And so that assistance and that other things that come in there, but it may take you a little bit of extra time, which doesn't always get calculated into that cost. So I'm very clear in saying I want to be a little bit open about that one. Now, earlier, I talked about the fact that we were looking at the social and ethical benefits, and we're reflecting society's change. Well, I want to actually put to you here that according to the Generation Z survey by Deloitte in Australia, to win the hearts of Generation Z, companies and employers will need to highlight their efforts to be good global citizens. So that goes into sustainability, and I'm about to link disability into your sustainability, but it also goes into social covers and within the broader ESG kind of thing. So can we actually afford to alienate Gen Z workers who are expecting this as part of their roles? And 42% of Gen Z see their job as a key part of their identity. So they don't separate it. And that's a really interesting thing. So that's where, if we want to bring and attract that workforce, which is going to be a good portion of our workforce very, very soon, then we need to mold our businesses towards accounting for that. And they have a huge social conscience around disability inclusion. Let's be a little bit more simple. It has impact on your shareholders' returns. Champions of disability inclusion were twice as likely as others to have higher total shareholder returns than those of their peer group. And champions that have improved disability inclusion of disabled people over time are 4 times more likely than others to have total shareholder returns that outperform those of their peer group. It's good for the bottom line. It's good for your shareholders. It's good for everyone. And so it really does equate so much deeper in this than just, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. We're doing it because we need to attract our staff. We're doing it because we want our staff to feel like they belong. We're doing it because it's going to help us be better at serving our customers. We're doing it because it makes good business sense. And then there's been a recent report out of the UN, the International Labour Organization, and we can actually achieve our sustainability goals, which I know is prevalent within this sector, without actually thinking about disability inclusion. So that broader ESG space does come together, and it comes together in the way that green decisions can also benefit disabled people, and accessibility decisions can also be green. So the environmental pillar, there's no reason that we have one and the other, is what we're saying here within the ESG. From the social pillar point of view, this is the logical place where we'd come and think about disability inclusion. But it's quite often seen as the poor cousin to the other DEI pillars and parts of this. And it shouldn't be, because disability is that one DEI group that we can become a part of at any time in our life. And it's actually one of the most prevalent ones, unless you want to go for gender. Gender's a little bit more prevalent. But apart from that, it really does fit in there. And so this pillar includes a broad ranges of areas such as accessibility of the workplace, products and services, non-discrimination policies, supplier diversity, and inclusive corporate culture. And so if we start to report on these and measure these and think about these and put them into our sustainability reporting, we're actually going to see some interesting results, both on our culture, on our reputation, and ultimately on our bottom line. And then, of course, there is the governance pillar in ESG as well. And that means that we're, by embedding disability inclusion into governance, companies not only enhance their social responsibility, but also mitigate risks associated with discrimination and non-compliance parts as well. For instance, denial of reasonable accommodations may constitute an act of discrimination. And because we have the acts that we've talked about, we could become unstuck a little bit there. But I actually want to take it away from the pillars and talk about the fact that international investors are starting to look at what we're calling the purple dollar. So I've heard about the green dollar, but we are actually starting to see a move towards the purple dollar as well, and that broader social engagement. So what are you doing here can help a socially conscious investor feel confident to put money into your organization. That purple investor quite often might be happier with a slightly lower return in order to be investing in something that's doing good with their money. Customers are increasingly being selective about the organisations they work with. It's the age of we can get so much information about everything, so we have choice. It's the age of choice about who we work with. And there's a figure here from the Purple Pound survey in 2022 said 72% of disabled customers would go to a different website if they can't access what they need on that website because of accessibility issues. They're gone, lost. And when they find the one that works, they stick with it, and they stay with, and they become really loyal customers to the one that did that work. Talking about it from another perspective, around controversies around thing, this can actually, if you don't get this right and you actually continue to make a mistake, it can start with about a 0.37% impact on your sharehold thing over the first few months. But if you don't deal with your ESG controversies and you let them build, and you let them, or you get multiple things and you get a few that come back to back or things like that, the difference can be on your share price somewhere between negative 1.3% to negative 7.5%. It can make a huge difference on it, and your stock takes huge impacts. So if we actually get to saying, well, okay, we're going to be a little bit responsible around this, and we're going to actually do some baseline assessments. We're going to set ourselves some goals and targeting, tracking. We're going to look at our stakeholder engagement, and we're going to do some risk management around this. You are actually signaling to the world that you're doing this right, and that you're thing. You don't have to be perfect. Please don't ever expect that any of our expectations are that you're perfect at any point. There is not a perfect organisation in New Zealand. I don't care whether you're whaikaha, the Ministry of Disabled People, or whether you're Blind Low Vision, or whether you're Westpac or Air New Zealand, or I don't know, Auckland Airport. There's just nobody is perfect. We're all on a journey, and we do our best, but it is a journey and it's not a destination. So coming back to your things, your things that we identified at the start: attracting, recruiting, training, and retention of staff. So in a heavily regulated market, I acknowledge this, and safety is regularly considered a reason not to employ a disabled person. And we get it's heavily regulated, we can't get their approvals for airside, we can't get their approvals for whatever, and going through. Now, that's that slide I brought up earlier. We need to be really careful here. I know that the CA grants broad powers to AVSEC for the security purposes and accrediting people for the health and safety perspective as well. But there is a responsibility that these powers must be exercised in a way that respects human rights, especially around non-discrimination, privacy, and reasonable accommodations. And principles of necessity, proportionality, and the least intrusive must be a part of the way that they make their decisions. And I think that sometimes it's the way that we might think about the way that we present it and the way that we bring it forward that may or may not help there. So I want to explore a little bit here around reasonable accommodations and what the law actually says around reasonable accommodations. So in law, there are 8 objective measures to provide guidance on what could be considered a reasonable accommodation. This is what's covered under the Human Rights Act. Okay, I'm paraphrasing them. Please always seek additional advice. I'll put that little caveat in there. And please work with the things, but just to give you a bit of an idea. So the first one is effectiveness. Would that accommodation actually assist the person to do their job? Is it practical to make that adjustment? How much of an impact is it going to have on other employees and the operations of the organisation? I get that. Absolutely get that. What are the financial costs or other costs of the adjustment? Now I'm going to bring this to a thing, but what The fifth one is the extent of the organization's resources. So the cost actually looks at, are you a small business with a limited fund? But the cost also, back there, needs to consider what supports are available. So the job support fund that comes from MSD allocates a lot of money to an individual to provide those adjustments and to provide the technology, the assistive technology, assistive devices, the modifications to the workplace to allow them to do it. So it doesn't always fall on you. So that cost needs to be relevant to the cost to you, not the cost overall. So we talked about resources. Next one is disruption. Whether the adjustment would cause any disruption to the business or other people. Obviously, we're not wanting to destroy your business whilst we do whatever. So we need to be a little bit practical about that. Health and safety definitely comes in here. We're not going to create environments where we're creating a health and safety adjustment or a problem. But I'll give you an example of where health and safety can sometimes be used as an example of why not to do it. But in actual fact, it ended up being good for the environment. So I'll use Garage Project Brewery in Wellington. I don't know who's enjoyed their beers, pretty good beers. I'll give a shout out to them. But with the Garage Project, they had a deaf man approach wanting to work on the, sorry if you just heard the dog going off in the background, a little bit distracting, wanting to work for them. So that a deaf man come to them and say, I want to work for you. I'm absolutely passionate about this. I want to be in here. And there was real concern that they couldn't accommodate them into the brewery floor because it was a noisy environment. They yelled over the top. The ability to hear everything was going to be a problem. He was, let's say, relentless in his, or persistent might be a better word, persistent in his thing, and so they decided to give him a go. Now, actually what happened was he went and worked, and I can't remember his name. Let's just go with a nice generic one. Let's go with John. Okay, so John was persistent, but all of a sudden the team were sitting in the morning break, in the morning tea room with John, and they wanted to communicate with him. So they learned some really basic New Zealand Sign Language. Then they learned some more New Zealand Sign Language. And before you knew it, they actually had a reasonable level of proficiency to be able to communicate with him. Now, the problem is, in a noisy environment, yelling across at each other is one of the worst things you can do. So in actual fact, it became, they moved to using sign language on the brewery floor to communicate with each other. And it became a safer environment because they could communicate without the risk of lost information. Because once they had the sight of somebody, they could communicate across and know that the message got across. And so John's involvement in the environment actually equaled a real change. And John left about 5 years ago, from my understanding. But to this day, they still use that sign language to communicate across the brewery floor because it was a safer and better way of communicating. Okay, and then the last one, so just to move on, the last one was the impact on others, how the adjustment might affect other employees or operations. So we need to be really careful as we apply these measures. Did I have impact on others twice? I did. Okay, I'm going to need to check what the 8th one is. Thank you for picking that up, Brian. Which one have I'm not going to get the one that I've missed. But you get the point. There's this measures where we've got to look at it really objectively and go forwards. Apologies for mucking that one up. What I actually say is the easiest thing you can do start with a position of saying yes and then figure out how, rather than starting with a position of no and then seeing whether it's possible. And I know that's such a unique, or such a change of how we might traditionally work. We're always, when we're looking to employ somebody, we're looking for the person who's the simplest solution to our problems, that can come in and just get the job done, make our lives simpler. But if we start with this yes, I tell you what, there's just story after story of people who have really changed organizations and made a huge difference. Any questions about that before I move on? Yep, there we go. Marina's got one.
I thought it'd give you a little break and have maybe a sip of tea. But I was thinking about what you've been sharing, but also what Brian raised a bit earlier about once someone is employed with a disability, it's fine, but it's actually getting the person in. It's hard to attract. And I had the privilege of attending the conference that Phil and his team ran last week. And some of the things that it required this kind of thinking, the yes thinking about going into a job interview or even writing up a job interview, some of the wording was just off. So it would not attract some people in those disability communities. For example, some of the job descriptions would say, we need someone that can hit the ground running. Now, if someone's in a wheelchair, that's, it's small things like that that actually mean something more. The way something's framed, offers that you put in the job description or the advert that might say an invitation, the yes thinking, the invitation might say something like, please let us know if there are any accommodations that we can work with you on. So that kind of wording will attract more people that are from disabled communities than not. So asking them to present themselves in the very best way they can. A job description, a job advert should not be a quiz or an exam. You can give the questions to people in advance. It benefits both people with disabilities and people that don't have disabilities, but it just requires this exact thinking, having the yes before you even consider a no. Give them everything so that they can present the very best of themselves. Let them know where the parking is. Let them know that these resources available when they come. Do you need an interpreter? Don't assume that they don't. Think of the yes first. But all those kind of things I picked up from the conference last week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And please don't think that if you've got a generic diversity, equity, inclusion statement that says we want people of all different types to join us, that's going to apply, because if you're disabled, you've seen yourself be knocked back from 100 jobs because of your disability. You've seen that statement on every single one of those ads. So if you actually want to employ disabled people, call it out. Actually say, we want to, we're a amazing organization to work for, and we want to make sure that we reflect the full gamut of society. So you might say we want to be a diverse, but then you might go on to say, and we absolutely encourage people with accessibilities and neurodivergences to apply for the role. And we will do our best to accommodate you, or we will accommodate your application in our process. So you actually have to call out in the specifics to create the space. Don't think that just because you said something generic that it'll work. And thanks. That also gave me the chance to look up what the 8th one was, and it was the nature of the organization's activities. So a public servant, public service agency would have a lot more expectation than maybe a small private business. And all that obviously overlaps with some of the others as well, but that's what the 8th one is. There we go. Okay, I'll keep moving. So the other challenge that you're facing is educating people to ensure they have the facts. And a challenge there is, as so much as word of mouth, But equally, I don't think we're getting very good at training our staff on disabled people's rights and engaging with disabled people. And there's many reports, if I talk from a security perspective, of disabled people's rights being infringed. Being asked to remove a limb was one of the ones that I've seen, but so many more where their rights are being infringed. But also just where we're not learning to actually ask the question and work with disabled people to solve the problems. And again, we're starting with a no mindset rather than saying we're going to work our best to make this work for you, but we're going to work with you towards it. So if we want to get you on board one of our helicopters, Brian, how would this look? And let's have a discussion about it. We can see some challenges. Here's a couple of challenges that we've got. But instead of just saying, no, we can't do it, starting with we want to do this, now let's explore how we do it together. And so it's giving our staff that confidence of being able to move forwards with that. Obviously, the New Zealand Disability Employers Network can help with that, but we're not the only ones. There are others that are working in that space as well. Having disabled people on your team can just help change that approach internally. The word I'm after is not policy, not going to come. The word I'm after is not going to come, and it'll come in about 2 slides time, and it'll go pop, there it is. But it is bringing that forward, and it brings it into your culture. That's probably what I'm trying to say, the culture of your organization. And so people start thinking differently and bringing things forward. So one of the best things you can do about disability inclusion is just be intentional. But if you can't find the disabled people that you want, there are ways to do that. And there are things that we're exploring around building your ability to do that. But why don't you consider, as a sector, actually banding together and going to your tertiary providers and saying, we call this a talent compact. You go to your tertiary providers and you say, if you give us a disabled candidate that meets this level of requirement, in this level of skill, in this area of need that we have a shortfall of, then we will guarantee them an interview, we will guarantee them work experience, an internship, whatever. But you work together as a sector to work with the tertiaries through agencies like Ringahora, but also you can do this directly. The concept here is that you use your power to go to them. And what you will do then is start encouraging those tertiaries to train more disabled people in these roles, because they know that there's a path forwards, where what was historically a hard path to get through, now is an easier path. And so they'll look for the candidates and the students that are going to, for their potential students that are going to meet that, because they know that they're meeting this broad need. But that's going to need some intention, and it's going to need a bit of long-term sight and foresight. If you want to communicate with the disabled community, obviously the work that Air New Zealand has just commissioned that we were a part of with that, it's Air New Zealand's report. It's not my space to give out all the details that come from within there. But what I'll say is a little investment goes a long way to building confidence, and partnering with organisations that are connected is one of the best ways you can get engagement. It's really one of the reasons the New Zealand Disability Employers Network came into existence, and we work on behalf of employers, helping them bridge back into disability, is because when we were exploring why employers weren't employing disabled people, the result of that was they came back to us and said, well, we wanted to be intentional about this, but when we went out and talked to the different agencies, whether that's a blindness agency, whether that's a deaf agency, whether that's a autism agency, whether that's a work placement agency, whether that's whoever, everyone paddled their own waka. They spoke in their own language about their specific people's needs and what they wanted, not what was best for the business or the employer, but what they wanted. And the employers got more confused than ever. And so effectively they threw their hands up and said, this is all too hard, and they walked away. So we came into existence trying to resolve that issue, or trying to address that issue of how do we help employers connect back in a good and meaningful way. That's our whole operation. Finally, talking about some of the ones that we talked about, my understanding is you have an aging workforce within the aviation and broader sector, airlines and aviation sectors. And so that means we've got a talent drain. We've got 80,000 people leaving for overseas over the last few years, and they tend to be our talented people. We're not going to be able to attract Gen Z as easily, and Gen Alpha, my prediction is Gen Alpha is going to be even more connected to those social issues. And so as we're doing all of this in New Zealand, we actually have to be quite honest here. We can no longer look for the perfect purple squirrel. That was a comment by Adecco's New Zealand's country manager, Ashley Alcock, at the conference that we had that was talked about last week. And it's what the recruiters look for. They look for this perfect purple squirrel that they can never find, and it's getting more and more impossible to find it, but they never stop looking. They always want this absolutely perfect candidate. And we don't have the luxury in New Zealand of doing that anymore. We need to look to those untapped workforces about how we bring that forward and how we bring the whole thing together. So that is, we need, if you want to address some of your aging workforce components, stepping into it from that ESG perspective, from that Gen Z perspective, from all of it, there is absolutely a business case for you stepping into this. And if you ever want to learn more, we're happy to talk that over with you and explore what that would look like. But all of that given, this is my one statistic that I want you to remember. And sorry, Mariner, you've seen this before. It's not going to have the shock value. So it's 100% of people. And funny, I used this slide with a statistician from whaikaha, the Ministry of Disabled People, and she hadn't seen it beforehand in a presentation I was doing with her. And she was like, 100% of people. You could see it on her face, like, oh, where's he going with this? But she couldn't argue. 100% of people have needs. Whether those are gender needs. I don't care whether you're male, female, non-binary, you have needs around your gender. Okay? Whether you have whānau needs, cultural needs, religious needs, or access and disability related needs, or neurodivergent related needs, or sleep needs because the cat did a tap dance on your bladder at 3 a.m. this morning and then you didn't get back to sleep afterwards. And so you're a little bit lethargic today. But 100% of us have needs. And we're very good at accounting for many of those in the way that we work. Why are we not so good at accounting for access needs? That's my challenge to you. And when we're talking about a needs profile of an individual, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, normally, if there's a psychologist in the room or somebody who's had some sort of psychology training, I get this argument instantly. Their heckles go up and they go, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not an exact science. It's not based on things. And I go, wait, let me explain why I'm presenting this in this way. And generally, I can take the edge off their angst. And I've presented it built as a layer of stones, where the physiological needs that sit down the bottom, they're your air, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep. The next one, your safety and security. This is, do I have good health? Am I in employment? Do I have property? Do I have a house? Family, stability. Love and belonging moves into the friendship, family, intimacy, connections with people. Self-esteem moves into the confidence, achievements, respect of others, connections, and individuality. And self-actualization is a moving beast, which they'll tell you, and that's about your morality, your creativity, your spontaneity. Now, you can be self-actualizing with some of the stones below Maslow's hierarchy of needs missing. And so, depending on your own resilience, your own makeup, you can have quite a few stones missing. But each of us have the ability to plaster over a certain number and to prop up a certain number of the missing stones. But the more stones that are missing, the less chance we have of being able to perform at our best and to be present in the workplace and to give us outcomes. So the point here, and this sort of addresses the challenges the psychologists have around this, they say, but you can be doing self-actualization and not have, and living in a squalor in the middle of Africa. And so that doesn't hold. It's like, yeah, absolutely. They have the ability to cover that. They have gratefulness and other things that the really strong sense of belonging. They can overcome those barriers. But the more holes there are in somebody's needs profile, the more challenges that's going to reach. And so when we come back and say 100% of us have needs, 100% of us are doing things to plaster over. We're showing up at work even though we've got problems at home. We're showing up at work even though we've got problems with our health or whatever. Okay? But at some point that might over push us. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Make sure that I've got some stories I can tell around what I call the success eventually stories. But we've got sort of 5 minutes to go on the scheduled time. So I want to make sure if anyone's got any burning questions that I actually stop and see whether there's any questions and going forwards. If not, I'll finish off just by sharing a couple of stories.
Don't see any questions. Yeah.
Okay, I'll share some stories then and we'll go with that. I want to talk about Mel. So Mel has a diagnosis of ADHD. She actually had a colleague in the same boat. These two, Mel and her colleague. Now, the story's true, the photos are fake, and the names are fake. But it's a true New Zealand story for all of this. Okay, except for my one, if I get to giving you my one. That's true, that is my photo. But Mel has a diagnosis of ADHD. Her and her colleague both had these. They were 2 weeks from being shown the door. 2 weeks from being shown the door, they were being performance managed out. Now, what happened here was basically Mel and her colleague didn't understand what was going on. They were struggling with things. And they weren't fitting into their teams. And they were damaging their relationships with their teams. They were doing all of that. Effectively, the organisation did do some work. They built the confidence to get there. And what happened was Mel was able to come forwards and talk about her needs. Now, Mel needed a slightly offset start time. She actually just didn't work at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, whatever time they were starting. And the role allowed for that. Okay? Not all roles allow for that. Give that. Now, Mel needed a different place to go in the middle of the day to lower the sensory impacts. And so she needed that. And she also used some sensory, they gave her some noise cancelling headphones, which helped with that. Those were the major adjustments for Mel. Mel's colleague actually had to change teams because she'd done too much damage to her relationship with her team, so she changed teams. But Mel's colleague moved on and became a team leader in that organisation, who was valued and doing great stuff. Mel moved on to run global projects for the organisation. This is somebody who was 2 weeks away from being shown the door because they weren't a cultural fit. They didn't work for the organisation. And it wasn't because Mel didn't have the skill. It was because Mel had challenges around her needs weren't being met. And because her needs weren't being met, she couldn't operate in a functional way to meet the needs of the organisation. When her needs started to be met, her capacity to do it jumped, and she became a super valuable team member. John seems to be my name, my generic name. Sorry if there's any Johns in the room. John has the prosthetic leg. John hadn't told his employer about it either. He probably had a slightly different gait to his walk, but nobody really paid much attention because the leg was underneath the pants. He always wore pants, and nobody saw. But the interesting thing about John was he was in pain every day at his desk because his desk was that far too short. About an old phone book thing. So a phone book under each of the 4 legs up, and what actually happened was John had a productivity trackable role. Now, they were really happy with John's productivity, thought he was a great employee doing great things. They didn't realise that they weren't tapping into John's full potential, and John's productivity, when he was no longer in pain at his desk because he'd opened up about his needs and they'd made some adjustments, his productivity jumped by $10,000 per annum. That's one employee. $10,000. It was absolutely amazing. And then this is the true picture. This is me. I don't talk. I haven't talked to you about anything other than I've sort of brought it in. I haven't talked to you about the fact that I have ADHD. You may have picked up. I'm fast. I'm moving forwards. I haven't talked about the fact that I've had 3 prolapsed discs, that I have talked about the aphantasia, haven't talked about my anxiety, I have talked about the blindness in my left eye. I've just brought it into conversation as we've gone through. I haven't talked to you about the way that through my career I've struggled with social engagement, and that came actually because came because I was actually bullied in year 7 and 8 because of my differences, which led to me burying a whole lot of stuff. And what that did was actually affected my career because I wasn't being open. I was holding back and removed a lot of my emotions out of it, and I was quite simplistic, which created problems with creating social connections, which also created problems with building trust with teams. And so there'd be 1 or 2 people, normally the empath in the team, who would absolutely not trust me and not connect with me. Not because I wasn't a good person, but because they couldn't read me and bring that forward. And so it's interesting to see all of that. But then you also don't know that I've been 6th in the world in roller dance skating. You don't know that I actually had a panic attack on a plane in 2023 because my son was leaning against me. The screen was out of action. It was this perfect concoction of things. And I went to... I sort of felt myself going, and he was leaning against me. I was really nervous about his sleep because he's neurodivergent himself, the overnight flight. But eventually I thought the screen wasn't working. And when I finally got something playing, I only had half the audio track. It just was a disaster, and I was forced to sit there in my own brain. Eventually I went to stand up, and the next thing I remember, I was laying in my son's lap with my looking up at him, and he's looking down at me. I'd woken him up, and he's saying to me, "Dad, this isn't working for me." I'd passed out. I actually fainted from that panic attack and passed out onto his lap and landed on his lap. So what did I do? I got myself up, dusted myself off, sat back down. He leant back on my thing, and we went back. I was just the good dad. But that could have been avoided had there been things, other ways that we could have gone. So look, that there's just so much in regards to this that could have been done. Had the staff actually just stopped and mentioned and connected with me, probably would have prevented that. So much going. But look, I lead workplace change. I'm a chief executive, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a complex individual, but that's me. So thank you. We're right on 11:30. I will hand over to Marina to do closing remarks and a closing karakia.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thanks for attending. Phil, your expertise and experience is greatly valued. Thank you for sharing it with us. In summary, 20% or thereabouts identifies with a disability. And so this work really matters. 1/5 of our community identifies as disability, has disability needs, but there's so many career opportunities that they're missing out on. And so going in with an attitude of yes matters, and people with disabilities need allies to get into spaces where they could be, they could move things that just are not moving, and we're missing out on it. So we need to empower ourselves to elevate our organizations with people with different abilities, all abilities. And so thank you for making yourselves available to be here today, because it really does matter. Please get in touch with Phil if you want some more specific advice for your organizations. And just letting you all know that next week on Wednesday, there is another webinar that we've now opened up to all industries where they can attend a similar webinar to this. With that, I'll close us with karakia, whakataile atua, thank you all. Have a great day and get in touch if you need to.
Kia ora. Thanks, everyone.